I want to welcome you on behalf of Rethink Labs here at the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan Flagler Business School in Chapel Hill. At Rethink Labs, we've been tasked with creating opportunities to connect faculty both at UNC and in the Triangle, and really wanting to build a connection for faculty with other academic experts, policymakers, and executives to really talk about the strategical and operational challenges that are presented by emerging technologies. In tandem with our research partnerships with faculty, this will be the first in our webinar series where we're looking at important questions around AI and its implications for business. We're really looking forward to your questions today and really hope this is the start of an ongoing conversation with many of you. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Faye Cobb-Payton, who's the Professor of Information Systems and Technology at NC State's Poole College of Management. Faye is also a program director with the National Science Foundation in the Division of Computer and Network Systems. On our panel today, we're going to be joined by Brenda Leong, who's the Senior Counsel and Director of Artificial Intelligence and Ethics at the Future of Privacy Forum. We have our own Professor Mohammed Jarahi, who's coming to us from UNC's School of Information and Library Science, where he is an associate professor. And he's focused on that intersection of technology and society. And then we also have Chris Wisher, who's now working with us at Rethink as an AI research fellow. He recently retired as the Director of AI Research at KPMG's AI Center of Excellence and spent the majority of his career with IBM, heading up the engineering and delivery of the first commercial IBM Watson system. I'm going to hand it over to Faye to get started.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. The goal of the discussion today is to talk about risk of digital discrimination and exploring that in the context of AI bias. We ask those of you that are on the webinar to please put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We will give each panelist about 5 or so minutes on each question, not for each panelist, but for each question. After which, at the end of the hour, at about 11:40 or so, we will begin to answer those questions in the Q&A. We welcome an enriched dialogue. We brought together experts from technology, from legal, and from the social technical perspective. And Chelsea, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question. Panelists, are you ready? This is to be exciting and to be fun as we discuss these ideas. So I'll start with the first question. Question 1 is, what do we mean by bias in AI, and why is it an important topic? And I'll give that question to Brenda first, and then over to Chris.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the chance to be here today and take part in this really interesting conversation. So I am Brenda Leong from the Future Privacy Forum in DC, and we spend a lot of our time obviously looking at privacy issues and data governance issues, and my particular portfolio is how that operates within an AI context. So happy to weigh in on that today, but to be clear, I am a lawyer, not a computer scientist, so if I say things that are technically a little bit sloppy, I apologize about that in advance. What is bias and why does it matter, I think is really the very key and core question here, and because it means a lot of different things to different people in those contexts, especially to a programmer versus to a policy person. So it has to do primarily with outcomes and with people's understanding of fairness in most cases, and what is equitable for how a system works and how it impacts either groups or individuals. So the bias can be either in representation, it can be in accuracy, it can be in statistical analysis, and which of those it is and where it shows up and in what context has to do with how much risk it creates and what the level of impact or potential harm is on the people who are subject to that particular algorithm. So for example, in many cases, we would hear about a system that is biased against, for example, people of color. And that's because it's not accurate. It's not working as effectively at reaching the same level of output accuracy as it does for Caucasians. And it can also be biased in the sense of where and how it's implemented, where it's used, what communities or groups are subject to that algorithm. And that's a different kind of bias than if it's actually working correctly or accurately. So each of those types of bias is important to evaluate, and it's very contextual as to which is meant, which is at issue in a particular situation, and which one is causing the perceived harms in any particular system.
Thank you, Brenda. Chris.
Yeah, let me start by, I want to level set just a framework about AI, because that provides then the context for perspective on bias. And when I speak about AI, I'm talking about what's called deep learning. Classic machine learning is great and everything, but most of the advances in where the problems arising to which Brenda was referring, are powered by the leading edge called deep learning. There's 4 characteristics of this, which I really want people to understand as a framework. First, deep learning is inspired by how the brain operational characteristics. By that I mean things like vision are seen. Well, this is where that inspired AI deep learning, image understanding, going back to facial recognition, some of the topics, hearing, listening. That's actually an instance of signal processing. Language, deep learning is actually the leading approach for language translation, language understanding. So and this progression of being inspired by human operational brain characteristics, that is going to continue to evolve and become more powerful. Second, deep learning systems can generate output, not just analyze it, but generate. What do I mean by generate output? You can generate artwork, you can generate music, you can generate images and pictures, you can generate text. And an example, a deep learning using language understanding capabilities can read material and then, for instance, generate a summary of that material. Okay, that's the second facet. You might be starting to get a theme here of, oh, wait a minute, bias, was it done by a human or the machine? And the third is very analogous to humans. When we have workers, and we are workers, you know, in a company, in a business, and you learn in your job and you maybe get promoted, or you move laterally or maybe upward to another part of the business. What do you take with you? Your knowledge, your learned knowledge. There's a very analogous in deep learning. The third facet is called transfer learning. This is the ability, very powerful ability, of deep learning AI models to use what they've learned and then transfer that and use that in another domain with some additional minimal training, but compared to training from scratch. So what it learns can be used in other domains, okay, which can be powerful, but I'll talk about bias now in a second. And the fourth is knowledge, and this strategically is actually one of the most important, powerful areas. I talked about transfer learning, where deep learning models, they generate what's called latent knowledge, and that's what it learns, okay? But an emerging area of research is actually a powerful area called embedding, where it's heavily used today, where the system doesn't have to learn like semantics of language. That's already known, and that's heavily used in deep learning, is embedding language semantic knowledge. In general, though, general business knowledge, for example, research in how to embed already known knowledge, notice I said already known knowledge, into a deep learning system and then have it learn from that. Well, in all these instances, the context then becomes this technology is going to enable more and more powerful, in a sense, of human-like capability in these systems. And now that sets the ground both for tremendous upside value and potential for companies, but what about bias? As a member, let's say this system is operating as a member of a team of humans operate, and they're using the system to gain insight. Well, with all these characteristics I just described and expanding, there could be a tendency to trust that system. It's been correct, and we trust it as part of the team. However, if that system includes some bias, this could institutionalize the bias just because they're trusting this system and not questioning it. And even further, and there already are examples now today where this technology can automate certain tasks, things that knowledge analysis that humans do today, this kind of system can do on its own. Well, if you then exploit these technologies to automate work that knowledge workers are doing today, and that work is biased, you can possibly just have silently automated the propagation of bias because no human is involved there. So my context is trying to give a view of where things are headed is more and more powerful, more human-like characteristics that can be exploited and used for very, very valuable upside. Bias is such a critical topic, not just because of bad outcomes, but because folks like ourselves, and hopefully the audience understands, this is an important topic, and lack of confident mitigation of bias will be an inhibitor to companies exploiting it and losing the opportunity to take advantage of the technology. To me, that's the lost opportunity cost of not addressing bias, because it will be an inhibitor.
Thanks, Chris. Chelsea, we've had one additional panelist to join. Could you quickly go ahead and make the introduction, and we'll move to the second question?
Yes, no problem. We're happy to have Timnit here with us. Timnit is the co-lead of the ethical AI team at Google, and also a co-founder of Black in AI, which really is a place that creates conversations for getting the involvement of more Black people in the field of artificial intelligence. Thanks so much for joining us, Timnit.
Thanks for having me. Sorry for my technical difficulties.
It's okay. So welcome, Timnit. So you're just in time because the next question is up. And Chris led us into this discussion about, so Brenda painted this picture of bias and talked about fairness and accuracy. Chris took us in a place that talked about deep learning and transfer learning and why embeddedness becomes important and sort of lost opportunity costs. And the question becomes that I have, particularly around this, is there's human bias versus AI bias. Are they naturally different, and are they the same in nature? And are there factors which precede training data, and we all know about training the data, which introduce bias in and of itself?
So I talk about some of this for people who are interested in more in a 3-part tutorial called Fate CV. So I'll just write it for people. CV tutorial. It's on YouTube, and also in a paper called Lessons from Archives. Talk about different forms of bias. But it depends, right? So I'm glad that when people were when talking about bias earlier, they weren't just reducing it to the data set, because this is something that I think is dangerous, and I got into a whole thing with Jan LeCun on Twitter based on that. But so there's a number of things in my opinion. One is that so my colleague Christian Lom and William Isaac, for example, wrote a paper about predictive policing. And this work actually in part led to LAPD not using PredPol, which is predictive policing tool that they were using. And so what they were, I'm just giving this example to show the type of interplay between human bias and the algorithmic bias and training data, for example. And so they talked about what they called runway feedback loops, and some other people have also written about this. And so what happens is that yes, there's human bias. The AI bias can also, I mean, I don't like talking about AI as if it's a human or a standalone thing, right? It's a model or a system that consists of data model people. And so what they showed is that what are these runway feedback loops? For example, in the case of predictive policing, you know, we know Black and brown neighborhoods are overly policed, and so if you police more people, you're going to arrest more people. And so your training data that you're using to predict what they call crime hotspots, or try to predict crime hotspots, it doesn't depend on who's arrested, right? I'm sorry, it doesn't depend on who committed a crime. It's who is arrested. So you have this ground truth training data based on who is arrested. which is obviously going to be extremely discriminatory towards Black and brown people. And this has been shown many times, so I don't think we need to go in that direction. And then what you say is, okay, we need to have more, this is a crime hotspot, so we need to have more police in this particular neighborhood, which happens to be brown and Black people. You send even more police there, you arrest more people, and then you confirm sort of what you thought, and then you feed this into your training data, and then you can continue to amplify whatever societal issues existed. And so this is what they call runway feedback loops. And then imagine another aspect of this could be that you have this one algorithm or one model that is used everywhere, right? It's very different from one human making decisions everywhere, right? So these are the ways in which I think it's different. And there's many other things I can discuss, but I thought this was a good example.
Okay, thank you, Timnit. Chris, how do you respond to that, right?
Yeah.
Because let me interject very quickly, because what Timnit did is she brought in the idea of the lived experience, right? You have this thing that's an AI, right? And we don't want to make it such that it sounds like a human, but she talked about how people experience AI on a real world level, right? So how do you respond to that in regard to bias and deep learning and the like?
Yeah. There's actually one school of thought that says biased algorithms are easier to fix than biased people.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll probably get into this later. I think with what advice would we have for the audience is, okay, where do I get started? And Timnit referred to, I think, a plethora of tools that are out there that can operate against models to mitigate bias. Notice I didn't say to obviate bias, to help mitigate, okay? But I, as you know from my prior comments, I like to draw analogies from humans. And when I was talking about deep learning and its evolution and inspired by human brain operation and how humans operate, there are similarities you can draw between human bias and AI. For example, unrelated to training data is humans. I'll give you an example. I call it framing the problem. So suppose it's a mortgage company that's the person's job is to adjudicate whether or not to approve a mortgage loan application for an individual. And well, what do companies do that are in that business to mitigate bias? Well, one thing they do is do post audits down the road to go back and look at portfolios actually by loan adjudication person. How did they do? What were they doing? Well, let's say you find out in doing that Bob in cubicle 3 has rejected every mortgage application from a certain zip code. And well, you go to Bob and say, hey, Bob, what's going on here? And Bob says, oh, well, I'm paid and measured on loans that don't default. I get dinged in my pay for every time I'm issued a mortgage that later goes bad. And I've learned over time, I've learned over time, if I, give anyone a loan in that zip code, there's a high probability it's going to default and I'm going to get dinged in my pay. Is Bob biased? Well, yeah, you look at that zip code, but did he do it because of bias? No, because his problem was framed as you get paid on issuing mortgages that don't fail. Now, conversely, if you gave trained an AI system to only give mortgages that have a low probability of failing, it'll come up with, theoretically, the same activity that Bob did. So framing the problem actually is a problem both for humans and for AI. So there's analogous, not one for one, but inspired by bias in humans and what do companies do to mitigate bias. And then analogous, does that inspire an approach or a way of thinking about AI systems? And notice, Timnit was right on. Training data is commonly viewed as commonly viewed by some as the cause. It's not the cause. It's certainly an important one, and we'll talk about later about ways to mitigate that. But
Sure.
there's all these other aspects, like framing the problem, that are inherent both with humans and with AI.
Okay. So we could keep going with that running thread, but for the sake of time, we're going to move to the next question, which I'm going to give to Brenda and Mohammed. We've not forgotten about you, so hang tight. So the question is, Brenda, I know the written question was, is there a perfect system? And I don't prescribe that there's a perfect system. So I'm going to rephrase perfect to, is there an ideal system without bias that we are moving towards, in your opinion, and based on your expertise?
Well, I think in a sense that's an easy question to answer because
I know, right?
You know, we're not only not going to be perfect, we're really probably never even going to hit close to ideal. But right. I think the question is, can we acknowledge the shortfalls of the existing systems that are run by humans or humans with statistical and computerized help prior to the machine learning level of analysis and prediction? And can we use those new and additional tools to make that better rather than exacerbate the problems that exist now? And I think the answer to that can be yes, but it's going to take a lot of thoughtful care as we implement those systems, not to just further automate, further embed, or further exacerbate the existing problems that we have. So as Chris very accurately pointed out, humans can be either intentionally or unintentionally biased depending on what their incentives are set up to be for success and outputs. So are systems. When they are designed, they are given priorities and they are given weighted factors to consider, and they will operate to maximize those. And so depending on how they're designed and what they're designed to maximize, they're either going to continue those biases and those problems, or they can hopefully be designed to ameliorate them or make them better, make them lesser. But obviously to the ideal question, it would be lovely if we could get to an ideal world, but I think realistically we all understand that's not going to happen. I think the more important, because more realistic question is, how do we use these systems in an effective way to be better than what we are now, and not sort of have this mental image of this system isn't working well because it's not perfect, and say, wait a minute, is it doing what we were doing before or doing some new thing better or in a fairer way than we can otherwise manage it? Or is it causing problems and increasing risks? And some of that is all about context. We can use a system that automates or speeds up or makes things more efficient. And if the risks are low, like, movie recommendations or map routes or something, then it's okay if it's way less than ideal or constantly sort of evolving. If it's being used in the criminal justice system or in loan applications or in employment opportunities, then it's much more important that we take really thoughtful looks at it to make sure that it's not either making problems worse or adding new or different problems to our process.
Yeah, so with regard to that, there are a number of, so in your example, I would say even the mapping scenario could be problematic, particularly for some people of color, right? I think there's data that shows that, and plenty of examples that have shown that. And oftentimes we build systems with one intention, but then are actually used for another intention that downstream can have negative impacts. So that brings me to you, Mohammed. Are there other types of biases beyond the bias in AI that really affects the effectiveness of the human into the loop interactions with AI?
Yes, absolutely. So all types of biases that we talked about, many of them come from system, the design of the system, the training ground, the training data that the system uses. There are other types of biases that may reinforce those systematic bias, and particularly when we are interested, when we are concerned about a partnership, a optimal partnership between humans and AI. Everyone is talking about partnership. We know that in many particularly knowledge-intensive types of organization, it doesn't make sense to fully automate. But the question is, how would we envision that partnership? Specifically, I can think of two extremes in how people may be biased in the way that they work and partner with algorithmic system. One is over-trusting the algorithmic result. The other one is under-trusting those results. And I think both of these types of biases are reinforced, are magnified by the problems with some of the algorithmic systems that we are using, the opacity of these systems. It's hard for people to make sense of these systems and understand how the system actually work in practice. So the first extreme, if I want to explain it, the term that is helpful is automation bias. We've seen this even in early forms of AI when people use them in organization, in businesses. This is when people blindly accept the algorithmic results without a critical perspective. Relevant to our conversation when they think that the algorithmic results are more neutral and objective. And you can see how this helps, basically how this feeds back to the bias in algorithm, because the person who is in charge, the person who has to be accountable about the result, accept those results without really considering them, without really looking into important implications of those results. Mm-hmm. An example of it, a very simple example, if you are from Middle East and if you want to open a bank account in the US, even if you are a US citizen, or even if you are a green card holder, chances are every 3 months, this is my personal experience, your account is put on hold. And you gotta go back and call them and make sure they should make sure you're in the US and tell them a bunch of different information. And this is when, and my personal experience, when I ask these people, they're very nice people, they do not wanna make things difficult for you. But the answer is, this is an automated system. It automatically tags you. It's we don't know the parameters, it's neutral. And there's no bias that comes from the system, which is not true. At the end of the day, I'm dealing with the whole socio-technical system that is the bank. I'm not just interacting with an automated system. And of course, the bank doesn't take responsibility. And this is not across the board. I'm just talking about bigger banks. Another really important issue here is organizational culture. So sometimes the organizational culture will actually reinforces, it actually helps automation bias. When people have to work really hard, when people have to multitask, the research shows with the rise of workload, when the workload increases, it's likely that people would cut back on actively monitoring their automated partners, right? They do not have enough time to pay attention to the output. So everything I said was about the automation bias. The other extreme is algorithmic or algorithm aversion. When people make it difficult to trust the algorithmic result, algorithmic generated advice. And we've seen examples of this among professional forecasters in different contexts. And sometimes people do not have enough patience with flawed or imperfect precedent that's set by the algorithm. Some early mistakes make it difficult for people to trust their artificial partners. Again, I'm going back to the idea of partnership. So automation bias, or another term that sometimes we use in research, cognitive complacency, algorithmic aversion, these are two important forms of biases. That again, when it comes to the partnership, particularly in organizational context, make it difficult for people to trust their partners.
All right, thank you. So we've talked about a number of types of biases, right? We talked about data set biases. There is association bias. You talked very succinctly about the automation bias. There's also interaction bias and confirmation bias within AI systems. And so Brenda, I want to bring you in to talk about how could AI be used to expose the bias in human decision making?
Well, a machine learning based system is a pattern seeking recognition system. So if we can create a simulated version using the training data, using an automated version of what we've been doing in a way that we can then design a system to evaluate and seek for the patterns that are in those. And sometimes that's kind of done all at the same time. As we're automating it, we're also analyzing it. Excuse me. The same tools that we're using can sort of inspect themselves and see, are they getting outputs that are fair across whatever determined measure we have asked it to look at? whether that's false positives, false negatives, disparate impact outcomes against certain demographics, based over time, over geography, whatever the question might be, we can have that system analyzed for those same things. So in some ways that can actually make us more aware of what the shortfalls are within our system. So an example would be in an employment hiring context. We could take all of our existing employee data of how many people we interviewed, who we interviewed, what their CVs were, who actually was hired, how long they worked for the company, how fast and far they were promoted, what our turnover was, all that data that we have probably now in our HR system, and feed that through as either training data or as part of an analysis. And then the system is going to learn from that and say, oh, your ideal employee is X. And that will help us realize where our biases are, that we're overrepresented with Caucasians, or we're overrepresented with people from Ivy League schools, or we're overrepresented with men, or overrepresented with whatever it might be. And that could be relative to what our applicant pool is. It could be relative to what our desired diversity of employees is. It could be relative to whatever metrics we're looking at, but that can help us identify that. And then that can encourage us to provide different inputs. Maybe we expand our recruiting efforts in certain areas. Maybe we change targets for our recruiters themselves. Maybe we put different screens on the applications as they come in. So some of these factors are not seen by either the person or the system. And we still have to check for proxies to make sure the system's not inadvertently recreating those biases. And that can help us make that system better than it was, hopefully. But that's one of the ways that we can sort of use a system to check a system.
So I know that this question was targeted for both you and Mohammed. And Mohammed, you expanded upon the different types of associations, but I want to bring in Chris and also get your opinion about how can we use AI to expose that bias, right? Because even in a recruitment, talent management sort of environment, how do you mitigate, because talent has been coming in based on a certain set of associated biases that may be built in. So Chris, let me ask that question of you. Can we use the AI to actually expose the bias?
Well, one facet of that is you can use, AI and deep learning models to actually look for outliers and anomalies in general, but you could apply it to this domain. And that would be a leveraged use in that context. Is Timnit still on with us?
Yes, she is.
I couldn't see. Yeah. I'd really like to get her perspective on this.
Yeah, I was going to pivot to her after you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with I'm like having my own panel over there writing writing resources to the panelists. To the attendees, if you're seeing. But I think there's many different examples here. There's some work, for example, from Princeton that showed that they did a kind of a deep learning okay. So maybe I have to, so there's something called word vectors, right? So where, let's say you see, two words, and if the distance in this space between these two words is, it depends on, you define it, but it's supposed to be that words that have similar meanings or are similar to each other in some way that you define, have a similar distance in this space, right? And so this can be very, very useful in many respects, in transfer learning and many other applications. But imagine now when you see that, there was a paper called "Man is to Programmer as Woman is to Homemaker." So they were doing these association tests. So the distance between, so the closest, occupation to woman would be homemaker, rather than to a man would be a programmer. So now, if you use this to find people who are programmers or software engineers or whatever, then you're going to have a very biased system. But you can also flip it and use it to uncover these kinds of biases, right? Man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. So that's just one example. And there's a few other examples. Like, for example, my colleague Vinod just had a paper, and this led to a whole change in Oakland police policy. So their paper, he worked with Jennifer Ibenhard for a long time, where they analyzed police stops. They use natural language processing, which is a form of AI, right? Analyzing language, to show that police spoke less respectfully to Black people than white people. And so there's, and they gave recommendations. There's a huge number of things like this. I think I've worked on some that we can do. But I wanted to caution, like, I also think things have to, they have to pass the smell test. Like sometimes, so one example is, you know how people, I don't know if you guys know about this example where people change the resume names, the names and resumes, right? And they changed it from white to Black, and you know, people and man to woman or whatever, and people don't get calls back. But then some people were like, oh, okay, let's replicate the study. So they replicate the study, and they said, oh, we didn't find the same results. And what did they do? They, to pick black sounding names, they went through the census and they found the most common names for Black people in the census. But some of these names are not like names that are stereotypically associated with Black people. That's why people were not getting calls back, right? If they have a name John that's as super common in Black people, but it's as common in white people, or like you don't associate it with this stereotype, then you're not going to see that effect. So that's another example of a data-driven result that had a major flaw that you can, you know, that where the lived experience is important, because if many Black people, if they were involved in that study, would tell you that that's an issue. So I think that it can be flipped to show some biases in societies. There's many examples there, but I think it has to be done in a way that's, you know, we have to be careful and has to pass the smell test. Yes. Sometimes you have intuition and you know.
Yeah, so the example that you bring up is very interesting, because a colleague and I actually published a paper on algorithmic equity, particularly looking at hiring, I say marginalized groups in information technology, looking at the very thing that you talked about in terms of the challenges that candidates experienced with names in using very well-known hiring platforms. And the issue is, and we sort of concluded the piece in an IEEE stance saying that it doesn't pass the smell test, and association and confirmation biases and networks still have a play in this space. So we've talked a lot about bias as the panelists, and you guys have been doing a great job engaging in the chat as well. But Mohammed, want to bring you in. What are some common approaches to actually mitigating bias? And what have you seen? Talk to us about that.
So again, I just want to throw in two other examples that can help.
Please.
Using AI to identify and mitigate bias potentially. So doctors, there are research that shows doctors have been using some of these systems, and it's not just AI mitigating bias in AI, but also AI telling people when they're making decision real time if there are important disparities in their decision making. Mm-hmm. The result is very early, but you would like this example, Faye, and I think you're quite familiar with this example, continuing on the conversation about CVs. So this startup in California, in Silicon Valley, Gap Jumpers, I think you are familiar with it. So to just help with the whole notion of CV as a training set, because it comes with a lot of biases embedded in CVs, and the previous examples of use the Amazon example of Amazon that would prefer male programmers over female because of the training of the previous training set. So what Gap Jumper does is it allows the companies to scrub identifying information from the application, from the CVs basically, and just bring to the fore, highlight the job-related skills. It depends on, of course, the context, and then allow people to just use those job-related skills in a data set instead of things that can reinforce those deep-seated bias in CVs like names, genders and things like that. So I think that's a very interesting development when it comes to racial disparities and gender disparities. In terms of from my own research, in terms of what we can help, what are the suggestions? I think, again, I want to go back to the idea of partnership. I think we need a better partnership between humans and artificial intelligence. Using the metaphor of human in the loop, I think human can look at the recommendations that are provided by the machine and making sure that those are not biased. Yes, of course, those human can be biased. But I think if we encourage that conversation, Brenda gave us very good examples that the machine using the big data, their analytical skills, machine learning algorithm can help us to see some of the patterns. The example of the guy that would reject loans, Chris, right? If we have this ongoing conversation, it might sound very ideal, but through that conversation, the humans and machine can understand each other's biases. So breaking the vicious cycle, instead of feeding each other's with bias, we can actually reveal and mitigate bias. I think one really important condition here is transparency of the system. One of the biggest problems with the current algorithmic system is explainability, what we call explainability. The process of decision making has become a black box in many situations, and that makes it difficult for, when I talk about automation bias, that is not necessarily a problem with humans. Humans that operate with the machine, that can come from the system and design and intended, unintended consequences of that type of design, which in many cases is not able to explain the algorithmic results and suggestion. The final thought that I want to throw in, and I found from my research on gig economy, where algorithmic decision-making systems, HR systems are so big, Uber drivers are hired and in many cases are fired by an algorithm, is the concept of algorithmic literacy, particularly from an education perspective. We talk about data literacy for years now. The new generation of people, or the people that are in workforce, they need to understand how to deal with algorithmic system. Some of this can be taught as analytical skills in our school, more data center skill. Some of it is emergent situated. Because of the explainability, black box nature of these systems, smart people will figure out as they work with the system. In my research, I really love people who screw the algorithmic system and work around them. Those are the smartest people. And sometimes they share those ideas with each other. An example of this is Uber drivers by, I think, DC National Reagan Airport. They would gather, many of them would switch off their phone at the same time, so they will tamper with the demand and supply equation on Uber, and they get a better rate. So that may sound very shady, but that's to me a very important set of algorithmic literacy. Understanding how algorithms operate, and it's very situated, it's based on practice and experience.
Okay, thank you. So we are coming to time for opening up Q&A, but I do want to get at least one more pass from each of you on a final thought before we open up the questions that are in the Zoom here. Want to get your final sort of comments based on everything that we've discussed today. What is one thing that you would ask the panel, or not the panelists, the attendees to think about when it comes to exploring AI bias within their organizations and then at the individual level as well? So Chris, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would ask the audience to think about a 3-step kind of framework here. First step is there's a plethora of existing tools and techniques to help with machine learning to mitigate bias in the base of machine learning. An example is, and there's a lot of them out there, IBM research a couple of years ago came up with AI Fairness 360. It's now an open source toolkit, and they've drawn in actually the techniques and modeling approaches from the best brains across the industry. It's open source, open framework. So that's base hygiene for anyone who's looking at exploiting this. Okay. Part 2 is an AI solution doesn't stand alone. I encourage people to think about an end-to-end life cycle management framework in their business, because it's not just about training data one time and running some tools to cleanse that. What I mean by framework, an example is KPMG has a framework. It's just one example called AI in Control, which lays out a prescriptive kind of framework of the end-to-end life cycle management you need to have in place, and one piece of that will be the tooling I prior talked about. And the last thought comes back to my original thinking up front is this is a journey. And throughout that journey, this technology is going to get more and more, when I say powerful, it'll pick up more and more capabilities inspired by how the human brain works, extending the thought I had up front. So one thought, this is just a strategic thinking, not today, is a framework wherein you start to think about, and Tim will love this idea, think about AI as an employee, which of course she had a perspective on earlier. But over time, strategically, we can be inspired by how we as companies and HR with our employees, an analogous set of inspired approaches to mitigate bias in AI. So.
All right. All right, Brenda?
Thanks to everyone for all of the great commentary today, and all the resources that have been posted in the chat as well. Really appreciate that. I think my final thoughts are kind of the it's complicated. To keep in mind moving forward that neither the system, the model, the AI, nor the human is a silver bullet, and that it's sort of a constant balancing of the relationship between those two, as Mohammed has made so excellently clear in his examples. And also it's constantly iterating. We're never at a point where it's like, oh, okay, this system is in place and it's operating and we can just, go take a nap. It's a constant situation of auditing and oversight and evaluation of inputs, of outputs, of changed circumstances, of new capabilities, of whatever it might be. And so it takes a level of commitment from all of the people engaged in that you don't over rely on the system, but you also don't allow too much autonomy to the people who are going to bring to it their own biases, because if they have too much power to override or influence the system and the outputs, then they're going to, contribute to that problem of sustained bias rather than, helping to mitigate it. So it isn't easy, and it isn't ever done, but it's certainly worth it if we can make these things better by this combination of resources.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed?
Brenda, that was very succinct. So I would again, I'm very fixated with the idea of partnership. I want to take it to the next level. We should see it as a marriage. That sounds like a cheesy metaphor, between humans and artificial partners, right? Mutual understanding, better understanding of each other. And one of the most important things is accountability. They have to be accountable in that relationship and also towards the outside world. And I've seen many examples of people ditching accountability. Organization, when I say people, humans is not just individual level operator. That is a bad level of analysis. But organizations ditching responsibility by just saying the machine did that or the automated system came up with that decision. So I want to leave you with the idea of partnership and accountability.
Okay, and Kenan, you have the last response before we go to Q&A.
But it's hard to top whatever everybody else said. But I think really what I usually say is that let's not forget systems are created by humans.
Yes.
Tools are created by humans, and so it's up to us to decide what tools to create, how to use them, what to use them for. And so I think I'm not a techno optimist or a techno pessimist. I'm in this field of AI, so if I felt like it was truly evil or something, I wouldn't work in it. But technology just amplifies human intent. So I don't think we should look at this technology as one piece in a system, in a socio-technical system, I guess, as STS people would call it. And I think that's just my final kind of word, is that let's not forget that it's humans. This is a tool. We're working with the tool, and it depends on how we want to use the tool.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll go to the Q&A. We'll start with this first question because I thought that this was a very interesting one. It says, who gets to decide what's perfect or ideal when we rely on a few models versus human biases, which is all different? So who gets to decide, Chris?
Oh, it's the context that I talked about previously, we mentioned, and Brenda mentioned this, is it's a progression. There's no perfect answer, okay? And that's why I come back to having a framework in place within which decisions are made. There's no perfect answer, but you want to have organizationally a culture, an infrastructure, a framework as to how, going back to Mohammed's context, how over time, progressively, you can be more effective in leveraging this technology in a symbiotic relationship. That's an overused word maybe, but you know, in a progression over time where you start with it's like a technical assistant to employees. And it's not making the decisions because there is no perfect answer, but you want to have a culture and a context and a framework where you can make continuous improvement and leveraging, you know, tools and technologies we talked about at every step of the way to ensure continuous improvement.
Okay. All right. So this is a question that I'm going to start with, and I think I'll start with you, Mohammed. I'm just going how you appear on my screen here. But this was an interesting question, and I'd like to get several responses to this. This person is from the UK, and this person mentions the word ethics, which we have not touched on since we've started in this discussion. And the question is, it said this summer in the UK, we saw the ethical concerns around invisible algorithms applied to predicting student or school pupils' educational performance due to COVID-19 impacting hosting of exams. How do we stop organizations using algorithms that impact us daily without us knowing it? And this was for example, and we talked about this, loans, mortgages, educational performances. Mohammed.
That's a good question. And
the social technical model is right there for you. So
yes. So yeah. I think, again, at the end, with invisible system comes invisible labor.
Yes.
People are also invisible labor in the sense that people are affected with those systems and have to embark on new types of work. I'm just taking it a very organizational perspective. At the end, I don't know if there is a good answer, but the answer is, going back to the previous question, has to be in line with an optimal socio-technical system where the social systems are in tune with the technological system. The technological systems are in tune with the social system. That technological system is a reflection of the social system, a system that does not trust its constituents, right? So the technology is not the cause. Technology, I think in this case, is a symptom of a lack of trust between different stakeholders, whether that is the government and its constituents, citizens, or an organization, workers in the gig economy, workers, and the platform organizers, right? So I don't think there is an easy answer here other than making those socio-technical biases visible.
Okay, all right.
About other people, Brenda and Tamnin.
Yeah, Brenda, especially from the legal perspective, the invisible algorithm, what do we do?
I just want to point out, first of all, that there's no sort of bright line across which one side is these AI or machine learning algorithms that are somehow invisible and in influencing us and having impacts on our lives in some new and different way that aren't just a continuation of the automation of so many of the things that we do that stretches back essentially to the Industrial Revolution. So what we're seeing and doing now certainly can have very significant impacts because of the way it scales, because of the deep learning examples that Chris gave, but these kinds of systems are operating in our institutions all the time. And the example, and I'm not 100% sure on the UK test scores one, which was sort of the second iteration of algorithms recently that was highlighted there, but the IB tests that came right before that, where they predicted, they assigned scores to students who were in the IB system without ever having taken the test. That was not actually an AI system. That was a straight statistical regression program based on a very small, very set number of factors. And it was the kind of math we could have done 50 years ago and probably did for, you know, assigning draft numbers or any of those other kinds of sort of mass programs where we're trying to rank and assign people. So these things are happening all the time. And I don't know that there's an answer to how we can stop that. I don't know that that's really realistic with our modern world of finance and economies and, you know, global supply chains and things like that. I think the question is, how do we become aware of what systems are being used where, and how do we pass protections, either legislatively or, you know, by policy or through whatever other means, to require businesses and systems to meet certain standards. So when we talk about things like our transportation safety measures or our food safety systems, none of us are really aware. A lot of that is invisible, and we don't know the details of what's happening there, but we know it's there. We know there's an infrastructure. We know there's an oversight process. It's probably not as good as it could be, but we're still willing to pick up the package of hamburger at the store and go home and cook it on good faith that it's not going to make us sick. And we're still willing to get in the car that, you know, has an airbag sign on it and believe that there's really an airbag in there and it's actually going to work the way it's supposed to when we crash. What we need to get to is those kinds of standards and minimums and practices that we can rely on, whether it's in privacy or in data governance or in auditing fairness and bias outputs of systems and impact evaluations, that gives us at least a minimum amount of trust that these systems are meeting these standards, even if we don't know what they're doing, or even if we can't always take the time, because we're not all going to always be able to ask those questions and challenge one by one all of the systems that we interact with every single day.
Okay. All right. One last question, and we'll hand this to you, Timnit. I thought this was a very interesting question about the Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. It shows the impact of social media in this space. And the question is, how do we make more of society aware of these biases, especially knowing that they can be biased based on social media platforms?
I think this is interesting because I was going to watch this documentary, but then I saw tweets about Safiya Noble and some other people saying that none of their work was featured. It was like an all-white male cast, you know, talking about what they thought. So this is an issue. This is why we have bias, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that happens. But I think that, well, I think this might, in my opinion, has to do a lot with the business model, meaning that, you know, you have something at a huge scale and it's worldwide, and you don't have people moderators who know the context of each location working in different countries like they should, right? There was just this memo that this Facebook employee who just got fired wrote about, like, how they were just doing this in an ad hoc manner. And many people use Facebook as just a means to go to the internet. Like, they don't even have any other options. So I honestly don't, like, this is not necessarily my area of expertise, so I don't know how. There are people like Zainab Terfuchi, I think, who have very specific recommendations. For example, one of them being for people to be able to go to have their data and go to different platforms, because to create competition. But yeah, so go ahead.
So, yeah, I was going to say, so we probably will end it right there before Zoom ends us. Sorry to cut you. We have like 1 minute. I want to thank each of you for your fantastic comments. I really enjoyed it. I hope that the audience did as well. Thank you for the chat and the exchange. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chelsea. I think we have about 30 seconds.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending, and I'll be in touch with the full recording. You're welcome to share that, and we'll also send the full chat transcript, which has great resources that our panelists were able to share in there, so you can take some time to review after this discussion. But thank you again to our panelists on behalf of Rethink Labs. We're really excited for more of these to come. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, guys.